All right, go for it.
Good morning, everyone. It's 10 a.m. on this Eastern Seaboard, and you know what time it is. It's a man who needs no introduction. You can find his work on theserious report.com, theserious report.com. That's Sirius. Did I spell that correctly? I'm a little wonky this morning.
Yes, a spot.
Okay, all right, good, thank God. And if you guys, here's the, it's Monday, Paul. Give me a break. Cut me some slack. I'm still recovering from the weekend. You can get his premium subscriber service, guys. If you haven't done so already, for less than a latte at Starbucks, okay, you can get daily updates from Paul every day, and you will have access to that, giving you the rundown of what's going on in the world, the latest in geopolitical intel. It is an invaluable tool for less than $5 a month, $4.75. You cannot beat that deal with a stick. So without further ado, London Paul, how are you, sir?
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Yeah, I'm all things being told, I'm doing fine. And yourselves?
I'm hanging in there, Paul. I'm hanging in there. Not too bad. Just watching the insanity of this world, man. That's what else can we do? Just sit here and commentate, and then plan our next moves. How are we going to? I mean, crisis is opportunity, so I'm always looking for opportunities here.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll just very briefly, I mean, if I don't say something about 9/11, I mean, I knew people who were unfortunately friends, colleagues who died. It was sticks long in the memory or every, 16 years later.
Sure.
And it shaped the world in a very bad way for a long time. But probably it will surprise people for me to say this, but ultimately, in many ways, it was the beginning of the end of the cabal back then. They made a very very grave mistake, not just for the obvious reasons, but for geopolitical reasons. And one thing that I have been spent years going to tell people, I never got around to doing it. There was a whole issue of World Trade Center 7 and the gold that was in the basement. And where did it
Yes.
disappear to? Well, it currently resides in vaults in Hong Kong, and the gold can't be moved unless the Chinese agree to it. And that's all we can say on the matter.
There you go. There we go. Incredible.
So, I mean, so most definitely, yeah, it did disappear from there and it was moved, but that's where it currently resides. But yeah, it's a day that I don't think I'll ever forget for many many reasons, and I'm sure countless people listening for the same reasons, and yourself and any American for that matter, and further afield. But yeah, it's just something I thought we'd have to say something about because you can't just gloss over it like it never
Sure.
happened.
Exactly correct, man. I agree with you wholeheartedly. And that was the kickoff into this. Basically, that event began the countdown to the end of the American deep state empire. That was it. That was the countdown.
Yeah, and in fact, part of the ploy, apart from the obvious bogus war on terror, so they could go into Iraq and Afghanistan and countless other nations, because primarily, of course, the reason they went into Afghanistan was to prop up the U.S. economy because it was collapsing at that point. And if you look at all the economic stats and
Yeah.
what happened after they went in because of the opium trade, it's self-explanatory. But the one thing, of course, they also thought it would do, they actually genuinely believed that the US people would turn, there'd be this mass rioting and civil disobedience, and everyone would foam at the mouth. And in a way, they kind of thought they could take advantage of that. And of course, it never happened, much to their surprise and much to the credit of the American people not doing so. But that was one of the sort of what you crudely might term fringe benefits from their perspective. They expected and they thought they could take advantage of that. And of course, mercifully, it never happened.
Yeah. Exactly correct. Exactly correct. Paul, where do you want to begin? Because this is
Well,
we're still
we
dealing
we
with the
have
mess.
to, yeah,
Go ahead.
yeah, we have to say something. I mean, as much as I covered this with my podcast subscribers in some detail, I'm sure they won't mind me mentioning some aspects of it because we just have to talk about the yuan denominated oil
Yes,
contracts.
that is the
I mean,
biggest news of the century, my friend.
yeah, I mean, I mean, I first spoke about it in 2013 and people laughed and said, this is, what are you smoking? You're absolutely insane. And then
Fantasy, pure fantasy, Batman.
we we wrote about it, talked about it for a long period of time. I put articles up last year on the website about it, and of course, at some point it was always coming to reality. And this is one of what I call the event-driven scenario. This is one of the big events in that event-driven scenario. And of course, without laboring the point too much, of course, it's crude oil futures contracts priced in yuan and convertible into gold if people want to do that. And, whilst I don't want to cover too much old ground, and, it's all long since been discussed, the principal benefits are currently is if you're sanctioned by the US, well, you can circumvent such measures by trading in yuan. So it's a great win-win all round for nations. Currently, like Iran and Russia, they're doing everything to try and sanction. It also kind of lends itself to the adoption of future gold trade notes. I mean, if you can settle in yuan and then you want to convert it into gold, and Iran have been doing that for oil trades, that's not a recent phenomenon. They've been doing that for some time, and it's why it's a good point to say Iran has around 20,000 tons of gold.
Right.
And because they know what's coming as well, they've known for a long time, rather like the Russians and the Chinese have. But it is a seismic step forward. It breaks the stranglehold of the petrodollar without any shadow of a doubt. The launch date's largely irrelevant because it is coming. And of course, how people will say, well, okay, it's obvious, and we've spoken about this, that there's been ongoing negotiations with the Saudis on this matter for some considerable period of time, stretches back last year and probably as far back as 2015. Now, of course, what China's done is dangled this proverbial carrot to the Saudis and said, look, we're the largest oil importer in the world, so this gives us huge leverage. Saudi's economy is suffering greatly because of the fall in the price of oil. They've got budget deficit problems and they're struggling financially. And what basically the Chinese have said, if you're going to prepare to trade oil for yuan, we'll give you greater access to the Chinese import market. If you don't, we'll squeeze you out. It's quite simple. So for the nations like Saudi, it's a no-brainer because their market share has fallen by about 10% in the last decade, whilst Chinese oil imports alone have risen 14% year on year during the first half of 2017. So it's a no-winner, but of course, this leaves Saudi on the cusp of dumping the petrodollar. Their relationship with Washington would be in tatters, even though to all intents and purposes it already is. And it's precisely why Riyadh's wanting to seek military cooperation with Moscow. It's why the King Salman's off in October to see Putin and Lavrov and whoever else, for precisely that reason. So economically, Saudi's got no choice but to dump the petrodollar because of its budget deficit. And as we said, the falling oil prices. Because if they don't do it, the future economic risks are massive. So that's one angle. The other angle is this much vaunted Saudi Aramco IPO deal. Now, I don't care much for the particulars, what stake the Chinese take. It doesn't really matter. What's significant is there's going to be enormous strings attached to this. That will include dumping the petrodollar and the establishment of this yuan gold pay structure. It's going to reshape the entire Middle East. It's likely to involve bringing an end to the Yemen war, ceasing this isolation of Qatar, and the embrace of Iran back into the fold. I think there's going to be enormous strings attached to this deal. And of course, China can use this economic leverage to create what would then effectively be an energy triangle between Saudi, Russia, and Iran.
Yeah.
And that's going to crush the petrodollar. It advances the uptake of the yuan, and it brings gold as a mechanism of trade for into play. And they're the principal kind of reasons. We could go into masses of more detail, but that is the nuts and bolts of it, and that is why it's seismic proportions that this deal is now on. And of course, nations are already trading in non-dollar terms for oil. The Russians and the Chinese, the Iranians and the Chinese, and the list goes on. But when you factor Saudi into that, it's the hammer blow in terms of the petrodollar. And that's why it's such a seismic move, and why finally, things don't always happen when you think they're going to happen. But when I put the articles up on the website last year, I wasn't saying it was going to happen then. A lot of those articles are big pointers to things that will happen at some point in the future. And it's not about having a crystal ball. It's saying these events will happen. It doesn't matter when, because the event-driven scenario doesn't dictate that in the month of October 2017, something's going to happen, and it'll be this, because that's not how the process works. But it's a huge seismic step forward. But it also leads us into other aspects to do with Saudi that are currently quite interesting, because what we've seen in the last few days is kind of indications that the House of Saud's creaking, because the Saudi security forces arrested around 20 people who are supposed to be opposing the monarchy, obviously in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And that all happened in a very short, within a 24-hour period. There was a pretty prominent cleric who was detained because apparently he said the day before that he welcomed that there seemed to be the impasse between Qatar and Saudi and the GCC nations might be resolved. And for some reason he goes and he's arrested. And then there was a report, there was a telephone call between Qatar's Emir and obviously the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, to discuss ways to resolve this rift. And then immediately Saudi suspended any dialogue with Qatar, accusing it of distorting the facts. So there's clearly, again, and we've spoken about this with regards to Saudi Arabia, there is definitely moves to overthrow the House of Saud. And that is why they've rotated towards Russia and China, for that very reason. It's, as we said, why Salman's going to visit Moscow in October. Right. The Saudi exposure to China and oil, because economically it helps them. They also want China to help them diversify their economy. I'm not suggesting that's particularly easy. But that's the plan, because they're looking for military and economic support, because it's kind of a fait accompli. They have to rotate east. And in all that, to all intents and purposes, the East has effectively killed the petrodollar from their perspective. When Saudi kills it, it's game over. And then, of course, what do we see on the back of the whole 9/11 thing? And you mentioned it. I know I won't go into great detail, but you mentioned it earlier with CJ about this, where the Saudis been accused of funding a dry run of the 9/11 attacks back in 1999. It's part of this complaint that's filed. I think it's 1,400 family members, and that's part of that JASTA bill, which is the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act, which obviously Congress voted last September, even though Obama wanted to veto it. And what this basically is the classic situation where the timing is everything. And they know it's kind of this thing between the Saudis effectively throwing the petrodollar and the US under the bus, and in the process, the US is trying to throw the Saudis under the bus. And it's not going to just be the Saudis. There's also, you can start to see an inkling that the Washington is going to throw the UAE under the bus as well. And it's getting that ugly in the Middle East as a result of this. But what does this do? I mean, it's like the whole Qatar situation. They tried to throw Qatar under the bus, the Saudis, it blew up in their face. Mm-hmm. And all it did was realign Qatar with the Iranians, with the Turks, with the Russians. And it's just the classic thing that every time there's a move to destabilize things anywhere in the world, it's just blowing up in the capitalist face in a major way, not even in a small way. I mean, these were seismic change, and the whole Qatari thing has frankly become an embarrassment, because, nobody really wants to move. It's like two children. They just don't. It's like, I want the football. No, you give me my football back. And it's just, nobody's prepared to do anything in terms of the Saudis. Because they're so embarrassed now that they've dug a hole for themselves and they can't dig their way out. And the Qataris are going, well, fine, we'll just carry on and we'll basically do what the Russians did after you imposed sanctions on them to do with Ukraine. They went, fine, we'll just go and work with other nations. We'll de-dollarize and we'll find a way around the mess. And of course, that's what Qatar's doing. And in the process, Saudis, of course, created another enemy in inverted commas with Qatar. And when they can ill afford to do it because they're getting more and more isolated. And of course, the risk is if the House of Saud collapses, it will create a huge vacuum, which is why they're desperately trying to seek help. And China and Russia see it perfectly. They don't particularly like this. They don't like the Saudis. They don't like the House of Saud and everything they stand for. But they can see that the economic leverage is going to be good for the future if it helps to change Saudi, great. But it will also be another hammer and a death blow to the cabal. And that's why they're using economic leverage. The Russians are using military leverage, but that is merely to extinguish the problem of Daesh in the Middle East, which is completely justifiable. But it's a classic example of how cabal continue to make mistake after mistake. So when people get frustrated and don't see any changes happening, there is massive changes happening, and it kind of neatly feeds into the fact that we've spoken before. It's worth mentioning about Venezuela, because we know for a fact there was huge moves, apart from the US sanctions, to cripple them and remove Maduro. And whatever we think of Maduro is not the point. The point is there was definitely attempts to have regime change, because Maduro was signing deals with the Chinese and the Russians, who are now obviously, and we've spoken about it before, backstopping Venezuela. So what does Maduro suddenly now got the confidence to publicly announce that his government will sell oil, gas, gold, and in fact any products that Venezuela sells with currencies. I mean, yeah, he listed the Chinese yuan, the obvious one. He said the Japanese yen, the Russian ruble, the Indian rupee. Basically what he's saying is we'll trade in the currency of the nation we're trading with. So if it's the Japanese, the yen, ruble, the Russians, etc., etc. And he said, we want an economy free from the US imperialistic system. There, his words, and it is possible. And of course, yeah, it's a way of bypassing sanctions, because the sanctions on Caracas barred US banks from trading in new bonds issued by the government, or obviously the state-run oil company PDVSA. And the goal is to restrict Venezuela's access to the bond and equity markets, given that its economy is in dire straits. It's got nearly $4 billion in debt payments to be made in October and November in a matter of a week, and its foreign currency reserves is about 9 billion, which is nothing. And the US actually publicly stated their aim is to deny Maduro's dictatorship a crucial source of financing to maintain its illegitimate rule. I mean, yeah. and they publicly come out with this. So they're basically saying, we're supporting regime change in Venezuela. Well, it's not going according to plan, and it was a financial and economic blockade, because the Fitch, good old credit ratings agencies, downgraded Venezuela and warned default was now likely. Well, no, what a surprise. Of course, it was default's more likely, because you're killing them having access to bond and equity markets and imposing sanctions to try and cripple them, so they couldn't even sell any oil. So Russia and China come to their assistance. But that's what nations are doing. You're seeing even nations like Venezuela, who was economically stricken, yes, politically stricken, and socially very much stricken, who are now able to stand up and go, well, do you know what? We've got the support of these nations, and we're not going to tolerate being bullied. And by the way, all we simply need to do is de-dollarize, and you can't do anything. You can impose all the sanctions you like on it. It's not going to apply, because we're bypassing your banks from trade, and you can. It doesn't matter to us if you don't issue new bonds. We just bypass that situation, and that's cleverly what nations are starting to realize they can do. But I mean, it's absolutely farcical that you see these kind of situations playing out in public, and the US just is still, well, the White House in this situation. I have to be careful when I say the US, because it's got nothing to do with the US people, as we know. But for the White House to just make these declarations as though, well, that's perfectly acceptable for us to effectively try and enforce regime change in the country, because we don't like the leader, because he's not doing what we think he should do, and he's trading with China and Russia. And that is something that the world is sick and tired of, but we're now seeing the backlash, and in the process, all it's doing is isolating the US in the process.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the recent maneuver. I mean, everything the US is doing right now, it's isolating them. It's they have nothing to do. I mean, they're trying to get this whole thing going in North Korea. That's not working out well either, Paul.
Well, no, because the plain simple fact is, and I did a big thing a fairly big thing on one of the podcasts talking about the history of North Korea and the US. The US has got the US has no intention of wanting to resolve problems with North Korea. It quite simply, in very broad terms, wants to create, and I said this on the X-22 as well, create North Korea as the bogeyman. So then they've got an excuse to have a military presence, which will rile the Chinese, riles the Russians, and just so they can stick their oar in and have a justification being that. If tomorrow, Pyongyang said, right, we're going to scrap our nuclear program, we're not going to launch any more missiles. Let's sit down with Seoul, let's have some bilateral talks, let's eventually look to have unification between our nations. We've had an end. that they would be furious because they'd have zero excuse to be there. The world would just say, right, move along. You have no reason to be in South Korea or North Korea or involved in the Korean Peninsula, full stop. And that's why they have to constantly inflame things, which is why they want to have these military drills, why they want to put the THAAD, missile defense systems, even though they don't work, as the South Koreans found out. I mean, here's the incredible thing: a missile gets launched,
yeah,
from North Korea. It goes over,
not too far away from where the THAAD is.
Yeah, it goes over the Japanese airspace, and the Japanese watch it fly over, and they're unable to shoot it down. I mean, you're not going to sit there and go, hang on, there's a missile going over our airspace. We'll just watch it because we can see what happens. Because you've got no idea what that missile's capability was. It could have airburst over Japan, and we don't know what its capabilities were. And they simply couldn't shoot it down because they've been sold duff. Pardon the criticizing US military technology again, but they were sold duff technology that's absolutely useless. And these missile defense systems couldn't shoot, a stationary clay pigeon off, on the ground. So it's just kind of farcical, but it's just the indication that the fact that, they keep pulling at the fringes with North Korea. It's not working. I mean, the recent developments in Syria, the Deir ez-Zor breakthrough is really almost the end of the Syrian war. It's not finished yet. There's somewhere to go, but Aleppo was a hugely symbolic event in liberating that. But the thing is, they've liberated the strategic air base, which is in Deir ez-Zor. Now, I think that will be used to deter the formation of Kurdistan in northern Syria as well. There's huge oil fields, so another reason why it's extremely important to have liberated that. But then we hear again, I mean, and this is the really sad part, I don't know, it's probably just US rogue intelligence agencies, but prior to the ongoing liberation of Deir ez-Zor, there was US aircraft spotted. They evacuated what's believed to be over 20 kind of prime Daesh field commanders to get them out of Deir ez-Zor, because basically they were abandoning it. They knew they weren't going to hold it. And what they do is they move them to safe regions. So then they can maybe regroup and launch offensives somewhere else. And this was going on. They were spotted on several occasions where a US Air Force helicopter, by all counts, moved these Daesh commanders out of Deir ez-Zor and took them to some safe haven somewhere else. And of course, there's all the US coalition's denying this, but even the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, now, admittedly, it's a bit of a grey area because that's supposed to be somebody who lives in the UK who's probably never been to Syria. Well, certainly, maybe
he's the observatory.
He's the observatory, but even he or she, I don't know, reported that there was 2 US airlift of Daesh operatives out of Deir ez-Zor. So there was kind of confirmation, and this is the problem where the US just don't do themselves any favors. Now, I don't know who's responsible ultimately for this decision, but it's clearly, they've lost central Syria. The rate of progress across that part of Syria was immense on a day-to-day basis. The liberation process is immense now, and the Russian firepower militarily, in terms of their aircraft, is just unbelievable. I mean, they're utilizing new technology now that is. I mean, I'm not a fan of war by any stretch of the imagination, and I'm not kind of eulogizing about it or glorifying what they do, but they've quite literally got missiles now that if you launched it and fired it at, let's just say, a tank, for example, all that would be left at the end of it would be like this small, meter by meter, or 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet cube of metal.
Wow.
That's all that's left. It literally just vaporizes the metal, and then it can condenses into, it's not exactly a cube, but it's that kind of thing. So right. If the offenses and the sorties they've launched in Syria has been immense. That's why they told the Americans, as we said previously, to get out of, because we don't want you to be caught in the crossfire in the process. So, but it's just, why continue to do this? There's somewhere in the US, food chain of the military, there's got to be someone asking the questions: what the hell are we doing this for, and why?
Yeah.
Because if it's a US Air Force helicopter, someone's given the order to pick these people. They must know precisely who they are and where they're moving to. And there needs to be some serious questions asked as to why this is happening and who's responsible for doing this. But I think it's a good point as well to mention that there's a lot of fear still amongst people to do with, the whole kind of Cold War mentality of what's gone on and the risk of huge military escalation and conflict. And somehow the Russians and the US is, on a certain level, there's all this talk, well, their relations are worse than they were during the Cold War. But there's always the flip side to it, that there's the back channel discussions and even not even back channel discussions where is very strong. I mean, you've got the Russian chief, of Russia's general staff. Now that's Gerasimov. Now he met with head of NATO's military committee. That's his name, Peter Pavel. That was in Azerbaijan, and they're discussing international security and that Zapad 2017 military exercise. That's where the Russians and the Belarusians have this huge military exercise, which every Western newspaper is foaming at the mouth about, that it's a prelude to World War III, and that the Russians are going to be permanently staged in Belarus, and they just want to be on the border with Europe so they can stream over the border and start, it's a military conflict leading to World War III. Well, it's absolute nonsense. I mean, these two people met, they exchanged views in terms of international security in Europe as well, and the Middle East. And Gerasimov briefed the NATO military committee on exactly what this Zapad 2017 exercise was about. It's purely routine, it's a defensive exercise, it's not directed against any countries. And the main purpose is to secure the security of the Union of Russia and Belarus. And they've agreed to have more contacts, more discussions, and this followed the previous discussion they had probably 4 or 5 months ago. And that was after probably nearly a 3-year period where NATO and Russia weren't even talking. That was all on the back end of, obviously, the situation in Ukraine. But that first meeting, which was probably back in April, or March, April time of this year, that was NATO's initiative. They wanted to resume discussions and negotiations. And this proves that for all this Cold War bullshit and this idea that they're at each other's throats, they want to kill each other, it's simply not the case. There's a lot of rhetoric, there's a lot of hot air, but the back channel discussions and these kind of discussions discuss all the problems internationally. Russia and the US have got zero intention of starting World War III and blowing each other up. It was never the case even back in the Cold War era. I mean, as much as that may surprise people, and we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, there were kind of people thought the World War III was going to end. The back channel discussion and are very strong and have been throughout the whole of that period, even during the Cold War when I was young in the 70s and the 80s. That is simply never was going to resort to World War III. And these discussions they're having is very crucial because, they're discussing international security in Europe. Well, it's pretty obvious that's to do with anti-terrorism because we know, and we spoke about it previously, the terrorist threat in Europe is significant. It seems to be at the moment sporadic with just individual people committing acts of, even though they're trying to play it down sometimes and say it's not terrorism. Yes, it could escalate and there is a risk that it could get far worse, and no one should underestimate that. But that's why they have these discussions. That's why they talk about these military exercises. They'll leave the newspapers to write the headlines and scare the hell out of everyone. But the reality is very, very different, and it's an important point to make because I know people don't read newspaper headlines, but the alternative media even stokes this narrative up about this, and it's simply not the case. The two nations have got way too much to lose to incinerate the entire planet in the process.
Yeah, no.
It's as simple as that. No one wants that.
It makes great clickbait though for certain sites and stuff. So.
well, yes, and that's precisely if World War III is imminent, you're going to get 100,000 people reading it. Even if the reality is irrelevant, people get sucked into kind of believing that this is a reality, and clearly, it's anything but that. So,
yeah, exactly.
But right. I think one thing to do with the Middle East that caught my attention is worthy of discussion. Now, we've spoken before that about that the Chinese have very strong relations with Oman, and they have done for some period of time. Now, I mean, this is a classic Chinese tactic, and it's a win-win. What they're doing is Oman wanted to build this entirely new city that's going to cost about $11 billion equivalent, and it's a transit-orientated industrial city in the
what country is this again, Paul? Oman.
Oman.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oman.
And it's on the coast of the Arabian Sea. It's about 500 kilometers south of Muscat. Now,
right.
They went, well, okay, how are we going to do this? So what to do? China is going to build this entirely new city from scratch, which will cost about $11 billion. Now, a year ago, Oman signed this deal and opened the doors and said to a Chinese consortium, well, come in and deal with this. So, because what this consortium's constructed dozens of full-scale new cities and completely redeveloped dozen more cities in their own country. Now, it's a good point to mention the ghost cities again. They're not ghost cities. They're built for future expansion and growth. They weren't just built because they had to do something with their economy. China always has a plan. They don't just build things for the sake of it. You'll see a huge amount of people moving into China in the future, and it's also future proofing when the Chinese economy rotates and grows and strengthens, that people get taken out of poverty into middle class and they will move into cities. And no, it's not to herd people into cities as part of some cabal plan either, which I've seen said many, many times. So what is this? This is another example of Chinese firms moving along as part of the One Belt, One Road to construct new cities across Asia, the Middle East and Africa. And it's in a place called, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, Duqm or Duqm. And what they basically do, they've dubbed it this Sino-Oman Industrial City, and it's going to turn this remote, underutilized Middle Eastern seaport, of course, as part of the whole kind of maritime One Belt, One Road initiative, and they want to make it into a center for global trade and manufacturing. It's going to be about 12 square kilometers or something, and it's going to sit within this huge economic zone. It's going to be a free trade zone, of course. So it's going to have not only a port, it's going to have an oil refinery. It's supposed to have a methanol plant, solar energy, a manufacturing operation. It's going to have car assembly factories, oil and gas equipment production site, and a building material distribution enterprise. It's going to have home for 25,000 people, schools, medical facilities, offices, entertainment. It's going to have a 5-star tourism zone as well, and the development is going to be, obviously it's a long scale development. It will take many years, but they project it will do about 30 to 40% in a period of 5 years. And the financing and construction firms are obviously going to finance it. Now, this Chinese consortium is made up of about 6 companies. Now, the argument is, people always said, oh, it's state control. Now, the interesting thing is they're independent. So then, from the Chinese state, but of course the Chinese state's very much pleased that they're doing it. They're fully supportive of this development in the process. Now, of course, the great thing is it fits perfectly into this maritime Silk Road. So you're going to see the sea routes between China, Europe, and Africa, and it's part of the whole development because obviously it's crucial to the development of the One Belt, One Road that you need the maritime Silk Road. It's not often talked about, but it's hugely important. So what they do is you develop this city in Oman, and then they can better access and secure energy and trade supply routes through the Middle East and East Africa. Now, it's no coincidence that about 77% of Oman's crude oil and its exports go to China. What a surprise that they're doing this. And it's one of a network of new cities that China's constructing in that region. In that whole area, you've got the Colombo financial city in Sri Lanka. There's developments in Malaysia. There's the massive port and free trade zone project in Abu Dhabi and Myanmar, and the list goes on and on and on and on and on. But it's another great example of why China's become this premier partner of countries that are going through many different types of economic transitions. Some of them are emerging markets. Some of them are stagnant or, economies that are in serious need of redevelopment. Greece, Spain is an example. You can even factor in the UK into that now. We've got the Hinkley Point power station in on the west coast of the UK. For anyone who's geography, you've got this massive development in the kind of Liverpool Bay area, which is all ports, etc. It's going to end up, it's a 50-year development that is going to make it as big as Shanghai one day, and undoubtedly is, one time Liverpool was the biggest port in the world. It went into complete retraction. Rotterdam took over and it fell into disrepair, and economically Liverpool was wrecked for a long period of time. But now it's under redevelopment, and it's Chinese money that's financing it. Why? Because they obviously see that the UK is going to be part of the One Belt One Road, and this initiative's been under development already for about 5 or more years. It's very low key. People are largely not aware of it, but it's another great example of how nations are actually kind of rotating towards the Chinese and realizing there's economic benefits for both of them. And also, Oman realizes that its reliance on oil and gas is its biggest risk, so it needs to diversify its economy. And people may argue, well, why is Oman going to have to be a tourist nation? Well, wait and see what happens in terms of the development. But Oman originally were looking for people to invest in the project, and the Chinese were the only ones who were prepared to do it. But this economic leveraging is changing the world in massive ways, and it's a win-win. The Chinese win, the Omanis win. And this is how you transform the world, and they just keep doing it nation after nation. But it's a great example. I mean, I don't believe they'll just build one city in Oman, and I'm pretty sure they'll start to do this all over the world, building cities, and particularly in coastal resorts. And it becomes a hub for them to then move throughout, the Middle East. You can use it to go through Saudi Arabia. You can use it about, obviously Yemen is a major problem, but when the war in Yemen ceases and there needs to be a huge rebuilding and reindustrialization of Yemen, then it gives them an opportunity to do that. And that's what Russia and China are doing. Between them, everything they do is coordinated. They're not working independently. They're joined at the hip. They do everything in consultation with each other. And that's why, if you look at them, they carve nations up in the center, not in a power structure way, but they say, we're not going to tread on your shoes in this country. We're not going to tread on your shoes in this country. So hence why China will take some of the nations in terms of their energy needs, and Russia does likewise. And they work in conjunction and they're really redrawing the map and changing the Middle East in a huge way. Not just the Middle East, as we know, it stretches into Europe in terms of the One Belt, One Road, and the Far East and everywhere else in between, into Africa. And probably we can actually start to touch on Africa as well.
Sure.
And the BRICS, because they had the BRICS conference, and rightly in some ways people have been very, very hesitant to embrace the whole BRICS thing. But it was only originally an economic idea, but this conference is changing it, where it's becoming more geopolitical. It's becoming how they want to be seen and embraced on a world stage in terms of, and having an equal say in matters to do with, the UN and I think, Putin mentioned things like the World Bank and the IMF, and it's a recognition that they become equal parties in the world. So there's a big shift. And the other big shift, of course, in the BRICS was this BRICS Plus, where they brought nations like Mexico over and Guinea. Now, they didn't come over just to have a nice little holiday in Xiamen because, it's a nice city to come and visit. They were there, and if the US needed a wake-up call regarding NAFTA and the Mexicans, that was it. And if people think, well, it's not going to happen, Guinea was invited. What do we see almost within a day or two after the BRICS conference is closed? China's loaned Guinea 20 billion over a 20-year period in exchange for concessions on bauxite, that's an ore of aluminium, which they are a big major producer of. The projects guaranteed by the loans included, obviously, this Chinese Power Investment Corps. This is a alumina factory, a bauxite mine, and a bauxite project. And they're just projects that are targeted as priorities for the first phase. So there's going to be multiple phases. And the revenues these projects generate will serve as a reimbursement for the loans. Now, the money they're going to use from it will be spent on the badly needed infrastructure. Guinea is one of the world's least developed countries.
Sure.
So this kind of what you might term road for minerals formula is what China's often used to gain access to lots of resources in Africa. it's a win-win for both nations. And of course, it allows Guinea to start to develop its infrastructure, so it can put roads in its capital, highways throughout Guinea in the process. They can extend the port at Conakry. They can put electricity power lines in and build. They're talking about building a university and trying to raise their education standards. And this is another example. And this project, one of the projects, sorry, in Guinea was supposed to be financed by BHP Billiton, who abandoned it in 2013. No surprise, because they've had much catalogue problems themselves. And this whole project's been on the cards for probably 5 years. No one could finance it. No one was interested. The Chinese go, okay, we can strike a deal. And in a sense, it's not barter, but it's kind of barter in inverted commas, where the Chinese get the money, they can build the roads, and from obviously the project, the revenue the projects generate by bringing these mines into production, it pays the loan. And also, they're not going to screw these nations in terms of loans. They do it at favourable rates. What China wants, again, and we've said this a number of times, they want to get these assets, because then they can ship these assets to nations who then will build the products, which will then be used as imports into China. So China gets to have a say in the supply chain, but they also get the imports into their nation, which is because they're rotating their economy. So it's hugely beneficial to the Chinese, yes, and people might get a bit frightened by that and say, well, it's all about China. But if they hadn't done this, these projects would never have come into fruition, because no other nation, no other organization has the finance to do it. What does China do in the process? Dumps dollars, acquires assets, or invests in assets. But it's a win-win for both nations. And if you start to see that extrapolated across Africa, and it's worth starting to talk about Africa, because we're seeing more and more investment, even though China has been doing it for at least a decade and longer. But we'll start to see more and more, because this is another extension of the One Belt, One Road. And now what do we also see? Sudan is interested in joining the BRICS. Well, we know we're talking about that probably some other time, because there's a big checkered history with what's gone on in Sudan. And once again, who's been meddling in Sudan? Well, no surprises. The Western cabal have been meddling in there for some time and causing mayhem in the process. But
I thought they were there for cultural enrichment, Paul.
Well, that's one way of describing it. Cultural enrichment obviously has many different meanings.
I thought we're there spreading democracy.
Yes, democracy with a capital D. But yeah, but it's just another classic example where the BRICS will become larger and increase in size. But it was early days. It was never designed from day one to be anything other than just an economic union. But as ever, it's stepped up to the mark. It's changing its emphasis, and the timing is prescient. It always is with these things. And this year there was a greater emphasis. We saw some healing of wounds between the Chinese and the Indians, which of course is hugely significant. And this, because obviously the BRICS was largely fractured. Brazil was, well, who knows what was going on with Brazil. There was huge internal political strife and turmoil. They were obviously trying to be turned away from the BRICS. Well, that's not the case. Russia, China, fine, no problem. India's got this checkered history with the Chinese. And also, South Africa's had major problems, but they're kind of coming back into the fold. And that union is beginning to start to look a bit like it should have been, because it was, for a while, you could argue, it wasn't really doing anything. I mean, the last meeting they had in Goa last year was just a farce. Nothing really actually happened, and it was all a bit of an embarrassment. But this year there seems to be a lot more emphasis and a desire to move this organization forward and make it kind of fit for purpose. And so it's not just being an economic union, but also geopolitical and looking to work. And also, of course, the classic, we're going to trade with each other in non-dollar terms. So again, it's another example of the de-dollarization process coming about in full effect.
Yeah, absolutely correct, man. It's happening at an alarming rate. The world sees the U.S. for what it is. All we do is we blow up the world. The only thing we have to offer the world in terms of any sort of goods, if you can even call it goods, Paul, is trash, recyclables, and pornography. And then half-baked military pieces of equipment that don't work half the time. And then we brag to the world that we have deep storage gold, and they should all do business with us.
Yeah, which doesn't exist. I mean, but you know,
I love what
the
China
thing.
said, though. I love what China said. Oh, you have deep storage gold? Sure, sure. You can come and participate with us at the New Silk Road, but we're going to need some third-party auditing to make sure your deep storage is there.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the gold that's never been audited since the 50s. I mean, you know, does anyone seriously imagine? I mean, this is precisely why when the Bundesbank say, "Can we have our 300 tons of gold back?" Well, yeah, in 7 years. I mean, if the gold was, and when they got the gold bars back, it didn't marry up with their audit. So clearly they'd been rehypothecated, which is a very another nice term for whatever it actually means, which is the gold was reallocated somewhere, it was sold to someone, who knows where it ended up. But the point is that they had to reallocate the gold and buy it.
Yeah.
And that's why they couldn't give them 300 tons, because you know, if you or I had 300 tons in a vault, I wish we did, but we don't. But you know, the truth is, you just phone up and say, "Okay, I'd like to get my gold back. You know, can I? Okay, I appreciate the fact you're not going to give me 300 tons in a week, but you know, over a 6-month, 3-month period through shipping, or maybe 2 months, I just want the gold shipping to this vault here." They'd go, "Yeah, fine," because it's allocated to you, and you wouldn't have a problem. It's clearly obvious the US doesn't have the gold because they were struggling to fulfill the order from the Bundesbank. So this idea of 8,000 tons is just a farce. But
Mnuchin went in there. He went to Fort Knox, and he looked into the pickle jar, and he noticed that the gold was there, Paul. So we could all rest at ease.
Well, yes, of course, yeah. I mean, we all breathed a huge sigh of relief.
I slept I slept better that night, Paul. I really did.
Yeah. But it's funny. I mean, another example of the whole kind of, and it's a clear example again of why the US economy is in such a mess. I mean, I always look back to 2000 when we had the dot-com bubble and the dot-com era, because I see some interesting kind of similarities between where we are now and people aren't seeing the similarities. And not sometimes it's because they have no interest, they don't understand, and accept that. But what happened is, I mean, back in 2000, we had this equity bubble, which was created by the Feds because they wanted foreign capital to support the US. Well, we had an equity bubble in 2017 and before that. In 2000, you had short rate interest rates going up and long rate interest rates coming down. Why? Because they want to entice foreign capital to support the US. Same in 2017. But what's the difference? And this between 2000 and 2017. Well, we know what it is because China was given the most favored nation status in 2000. Why? Because they supported the US's fiscal and budget deficits. Now, if you come to 2017, it's pretty obvious that structural support is gone. China is no longer going to support the US dollar. Everyone's de-dollarizing. Everyone wants to get out the dollar, and the petrodollar dies. I mean, the Chinese are the greatest exponents of it. So we're seeing US dollar rejection, and ultimately it leads to this much vaunted reset. It's also why, in terms of currencies, and as much as they're all fiat currencies, it's interesting that when the Japanese yen drops below 108, 107, 106, and the euro closes above 120 and keeps rising, it's another indication people are dumping dollars and buying yen and euro. Now, I'm not advocating you should do that, but that's what's actually happened, which just shows that as far as people are concerned, the yen and the euro have more value than the dollar. Now, the debt ceiling, interesting thing. We know it's all grand theatre, but they kicked it, down the road for 3 months, and it extraordinarily, of course, Trump got Democratic support and absolutely fried the brains of his own party in the process because they were absolutely furious. But the interesting thing that comes out of this, we still have no talk of a budget being set, no money available for massive infrastructure rebuild. Remember, we need $1 trillion. No tax reforms. Now, we've had the recent Harvey and Irma hurricanes. Obviously, Irma's still going to, although I think it's not really a hurricane. I think it's been seriously downgraded, thank goodness, but it's caused huge damage in Cuba and the other islands, like the Virgin Islands, etc. But, I mean, setting that aside, I'm not trivializing it, but the losses for that, I mean, in the US, I mean, there's talk it could be 500 billion. Who knows? It's a huge amount of money. And that Jose is coming in, so who knows what damage that might do. Now, what did they say? Oh, we're going to allocate 15 billion for the hurricane assistance. Well, that's like me going into a house saying, well, the whole house needs gutting, but by the way, I'll just give you money to replace the taps in the bathroom. You know, it's farcical, it's tokenism. And why is this the case? Because nobody wants to buy US treasuries or US dollars anymore. There's a massive crisis in confidence of the US dollar, and that is a clear example that, yeah, they can raise the debt ceiling, but no one wants to buy US debt anymore.
Right.
And they can't finance these projects. And that's why this massive infrastructure rebuild hasn't happened. Because for whatever reason, the Trump administration must have thought, you know, someone's going to buy the debt and we can do this. Well, no one's going to do that anymore. And that's why the dollar is dying, and this so-called confidence in the US dollar has never really existed for a long time, except in the heads of people on Bloomberg and everyone else. But we're now seeing in reality where that crisis in confidence is escalating rapidly. Now, of course, the one thing that these hurricanes and obviously the devastation, which is true, has been caused in Texas even more than Florida and wherever else this ends up going in the process, and the damage it causes, is they'll then blame that on why the economy is floundering. But I looked and did a bit of research into this, and we found that when we had Hurricane Katrina, whilst the GDP and the economy of Louisiana had suffered greatly and dipped by 5 and 6%, the national economy didn't in the process. Now, I know Texas is economically far more important to the US, and with all due respect to Louisiana, I'm not dissing it as a state, but you know, Texas is the energy hub of the US. So it's not going to impact the US economy like they'll make out, but they'll use it as a great excuse to say, oh, this is precisely why we've got these problems, and it's because of this that it's impacted the US economy. And it'll be their excuse to deflect away poor economic figures, despite the fact that they continually manipulate the GDP figures. And the US economy has been in contraction for probably 9 years by 4 or 5%.
Paul, the answer to that is universal income. We're going to give everybody $1,000 and grow the economy by 12% GDP. Isn't that great? We're going to outdo China by helicopter money.
Oh, you know, every time I think of helicopter money, someone sent me this great image of Ben Bernanke in this helicopter flying along with jettisoning all this kind of money out in the process.
I hear from good word that's in fact what Bernanke is going to do. He's going to fly over every major city in the United States and throw money out the window of the helicopter.
Yeah. But I mean, it's absolutely. I mean, no. Of course, the question is, it all sounds great in principle, but where the hell did the money come from?
Oh, we don't need to know. It's like asking how the sausage is made. It's, you know, being an American citizen, aka a putz. You know, we're not supposed to know where the money comes from. It magically appears from the government stash, Paul. The government has a secret stash, and they're just going to go hand out money, and we're going to magically grow our economy up to 12.6%. outpacing the economic growth of China, man. It's going to be incredible because these crazy nut jobs who call themselves economists have figured out a way to do this. And thanks to guys like the brainiac called Mark Zuckerberg, he's really leading the charge because he knows how to run a business. I mean, after all, he has a business that does. What do they produce? CJ, what does Facebook produce?
Nothing.
Yeah, nothing.
Exactly.
Well, actually, it's interesting that I mean, it seems pretty obvious to me that the likes of Facebook and all the current kind of generation of social media is going to disappear.
Oh, God.
It may sound unbelievable.
It's 5 years. They won't be around.
They will end. They will have no future in. There'll be some sort of anecdote in people's minds in 10 or maybe less years' time when people go, do you remember that Facebook? And everyone go, oh, not really, no. What was that about? And because, you know, the social media will move on. And, you know, I don't know that it's representative, but we kind of changed our tack in terms of Facebook because we had a lot of members in a group, but there was nobody interacting on it. Just see, most groups have thousands of members and about 50 people on each group who are ever on there. So I think whether it's just people have joined too many groups, but I just think people have kind of got fed up with it as a medium, and there's a lot of people disgruntled for many legitimate reasons why they don't like it. But I think it is yet another example that social media is going to change out of all recognition, and this might interest something maybe on the point of social media.
Yep.
There's a whole new internet that's being worked on and is in development stage that's coming out at some point in the future. I don't know when, and it probably won't surprise people. People might be a little bit surprised and a bit worried about this, but they shouldn't be. The technology is being developed in Russia.
Yep.
And it's a massive new. It's a whole new way of the internet working, and it's going to be radically different and radically better in terms of its uptake and usage, because there's a simple recognition that a lot of the technology that's out there now just doesn't serve the purpose anymore. And there is a lot of concerns about security aspects. I mean, you mentioned the Equifax thing, but as just one small example of the problems that we have with technology and in terms of security. So there's a lot of technology the Russians are working on, but that's one thing that's been in development for quite a long time.
Yep, decentralized internet. That's the future. It's going to be amazing. It's going to be peer-to-peer. I mean, our smartphones are powerful enough to run it. I mean, for the love of God. I mean, right now, I was one of the first early adopters, Paul, of the new, and I think it just launched today, but I got it last week. But it officially went to market today, or actually it's going into market tomorrow. Yeah, it's going to be tomorrow. That's going to go into market. Is the Samsung Galaxy Note 8. This is a phone with 6 gigabytes of RAM. 6 gigabytes of RAM. I mean, and an octa-core processor. This is like insane how fast this phone is. Our smartphones these days are powerful enough to become its own remote servers. That's the future. Peer-to-peer remote servers, completely deindustrialized. Good luck trying to control that deep state.
Well, that's what in the process. Yes, absolutely, and it's why the deep state or the cabal or whatever you want to call it is finished. I mean, and particularly in terms of this technology, it's going to move on. It's going to advance in ways they will have no control of, and they'll be long since not in control of anything anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But there's enormous new technologies, and they're not. If you hear the Russians saying we've opened this new research department, no, that means they've already been researching it. They've nearly finished the product, or we're looking at launching a product, or we're assessing cryptocurrencies, and we're going. No, that means they've probably just about finished testing it. Or this is what they do. They'll just say they give a few hints as to what they're doing, but the great thing is there's a lot of technology that the Russians will develop, but the Chinese will be the ones financing and putting it out there in the process. Now, that doesn't mean that the Western nations shouldn't do likewise, but I mean, there's like Russian mobile phones that they will withstand an EMP attack.
Wow.
They're kind of like sort of thermonuclear phones in the process in terms of their technology. So there is a lot of technology that
they're also hardening a lot of their power plants against EMPs as well.
I mean, there's a huge amount of investment in that, and the thing with the technology is it's so much cheaper. So it's going to put the Apples of this world in serious problems in terms of having. And we know that Chinese mobile phones have started to take. I know a few people who've got them in the West who like them greatly.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because a Chinese company called Huawei outsold Apple this year.
Yes,
outsold Apple. And we
know people. Yeah,
they make amazing phones,
and they're so much cheaper. I mean, that's the whole point as well. So, from a cost perspective, it's a no-brainer, and the technology is comparable and better. So, why would you continue? I mean, it's just a kind of perception thing in terms of buying such technology. I mean, and of course the Chinese will start to have more kind of investment in terms of their technology. But of course this is the irony. I mean, for years they're the ones who build all the iPhones and ship them abroad. Okay, not all the components are made there, but they put all the bits together and then they ship them to the rest of the world.
Right.
That's all going to kind of change when you're going to see Chinese technology manufactured in other countries, and then sort of shipped to the rest of the world, a bit like the iPhone is now, or the Apple technology, or whatever, Samsung, whoever you want it to be. So there's going to be that kind of economic shift in terms of how the Chinese operate. But yeah, technologically, there's some major interesting things on the horizon, and maybe not some of the stuff that people believe is going to happen. There's a lot of ideas about kind of what I would call Star Trek technology that people think's just around the corner. Well, it's not. There is some of the technology, but it's kind of way off from being that sort of development. But certainly kind of high technology, and the Chinese and the Russians got a big focus on next generation kind of technology. And yeah, and phones will be part of that, but also there's going to be different ways for payment systems, and we all know we've spoken before about the Chinese and the Russian perspective on cryptocurrencies and how they're going to have second generation and how they believe they can grab a market share in the process. So yes, there's a lot of the Chinese and the Russians' fear is they fear there's flaws in current technology. They're not adverse to cryptocurrencies. They're not adverse to blockchain, quite the opposite. But they have concerns, and okay, they'll exercise those concerns accordingly. But they're not. They certainly are developing their own technology, so they're not adverse to it. They just have concerns about it. But yes, it's going to knock the price of cryptocurrencies when the Chinese make statements or statements come out regarding their views of ICOs and et cetera, but that's just their perspective, and they have that genuine concern, and that's fine if that's perfectly okay. But they're not. People need to realize they're not against it. Quite the opposite. They've taken huge strides in terms of developing their own cryptocurrencies, both China and Russia. And Russia's been a bit more vocal than the Chinese, but they're certainly very interested. And whatever the future is for current cryptocurrencies, and no one's got a crystal ball, the absolute reality is they're here to stay, and they're not going to disappear. They're just going to evolve like technology did. In terms of the internet's a great example in the 90s, and how it is now, it's radically different. And in 10 years' time, cryptocurrencies will look back and go, wow, the strides that have been made forward in terms of those developments. So it's definitely here to stay, but it won't be as it is now. It will, and that's of course how all technology should be. It should evolve and get better. I mean, and if you want to, have an adoption of a cryptocurrency on a global scale, from my perspective, one of the big teething problems with the likes of Bitcoin, it's just too volatile at the moment. It's not. It's going to put people off. Where if you get news coming out of China that the price falls nigh on at 1.20% in a very short space of time, people get nervous about that. But that's why these problems need to be ironed out, because that is not going to make it something that people will globally adopt. Yes, the uptake will grow, and there's no doubt about it. It has grown exponentially in relative terms, but there are still concerns about that. And from my perspective, that's something that needs to be ironed out, because if it is, then the global adoption will go through the roof, because people will see it for the benefits it is. They'll see blockchain technology in terms of the enormous benefit, and there'll be a far bigger uptake. But at the moment, the concern is because of the volatility. And whatever anyone thinks, and it's not a criticism, Bitcoin is very volatile, and that is not going to help it necessarily get a massive uptake in a global sense, because the volume trade on a daily basis is enormous. We're talking about 10, maybe more $billion a day. There is relatively large interest, but it's not global interest at this point. It's largely consolidated in the Far East. There's China, South Korea, Japan. Yes, there is people in Europe. Yes, there's people in the US. But if you want to make it so more and more people will take, there'll be an uptake in terms of cryptocurrencies. These are the kind of problems that need ironing out. Now, I don't know what the future holds in the short or the long term for current cryptocurrencies, but the Chinese and the Russians think they're going to address these problems. They may succeed, they may fail, but they're definitely here to stay. And whatever my personal slight concerns are, is just my personal concerns. It's not representative of what may or may not happen. But I will voice my concerns, because I don't want in the future someone to come back to me and say, well, you thought this and you didn't say it. Why didn't you mention it? So that's just my view. I think there's massive pluses and there are some slight negatives that concern me. So I will articulate them. But for sure, they are, as technology goes, the blockchain particularly is going to revolutionize many aspects of, not just financially, every aspect of people's lives going forward. Is most definitely, and so will cryptocurrencies, but they're not going to replace the dollar or the ruble or the yuan or the pound or anything like that. They're going to they'll work side by side, but they will fulfill a very huge function in the future. There's no doubt about it.
All right, definitely, Paul. We're at the we ran a little bit over. We're at the end of the show, and I know we got some things to jump on. Paul, thank you so much for being on again, folks. His website is theseriousreport.com. If you haven't done so already, go there, subscribe to the podcast. It is super important that you do, and also and follow his work. Also, you can follow him on Twitter at @theserious report. And with that being said, folks, thank you all for listening in. CJ, take it away.